This is an Edison H coin-operated phonograph. It's called the H because it was based on the home mechanism. The H was introduced in November of 1898 and produced up until 1900. It was fairly late in the game for Edison. It was his first entry with a spring-wound coin-op. It came full 2 years after his chief competitor, Columbia Graphophone, came out with the Type N. It was also the same time that the Columbia Company was selling the BS at a mere $20, less than half the price of this $50 machine. The BS was much smaller and admittedly noisier, but it was also quite a bit more reliable with a essentially bulletproof mechanism, unlike the H, which has an extraordinarily delicate mechanism which is very difficult to keep in adjustment. This particular H is in really quite remarkable original condition. There were some coin parts missing, which is fairly typical for old coin-operated machines that had the parts removed when they became obsolete and were taken out of service and used simply as phonographs. The missing parts were precisely reproduced by restorer Steve Farmer and it put back into perfect operating condition. The cabinet has all original finish and original glass. It even has an original title card, which is quite a rarity in and of itself. Unfortunately, I don't have that specific song, but I have a different record by George J. Gaskin with piano accompaniment, so it's an appropriate one to play with this particular machine. As noted earlier, the mechanism is basically an Edison Home. The mandrel is actually rubber-coated brass. This was done to avoid cracking the record from the expansion and contraction of a metal mandrel with temperature changes. It worked pretty effectively. There are a number of added-on parts to make it coin-operated, and most of them are actually underneath the bed plate, but on top there's a number of different pieces. One curious piece is something that they touted quite heavily in their advertising, which is a lockout for the coin slide, and this was to prevent anyone from dropping a nickel into the slot while the machine was playing. And it did work effectively, but when you look at it, it's really quite surprising because it has simply a very thin metal wire tied from the spring-loaded lever to another lever on the rear of the bed plate, which is engaged by this clamped-on part, so that when the carriage goes to the beginning of the record, it releases the lock, allows a nickel to be dropped in, and as soon as it starts to play, it pulls away and blocks it out. It's certainly effective, but no one could possibly look at that and say that it was a particularly brilliant piece of mechanical engineering. The original advertising for the H coin-op claimed that it's simple in construction, easy of adjustment, and costless to maintain, and went on to say every detail in construction has been worked out with the greatest care and precision. This is really quite an overstatement given the tremendous delicacy of the actual coin mechanism. On most coin-operated spring-driven phonographs, coin has to be dropped in first to unlock the crank to wind it. On the H, it's the opposite. The machine has to be wound in order to reset the reproducer to the beginning of the record, and then the coin is dropped in. There is a locking mechanism on the crank to prevent it from overwinding. So cranking the machine lifts up the speaker, carries it to the beginning of the record, and then drops it back down again, at which point an old V nickel can be dropped in and starts the motor. It's not really surprising that there's so few of these that still survive. It's believed there's only about a dozen that still exist. It was such a difficult machine and such an expensive machine as well that I suspect the large number of those that were sold ended up being junked or simply converted to ordinary use. It took some time for Edison to come out with a spring-driven coin-op that was as reliable as the very inexpensive Columbia BS.